Awesome. Okay, welcome everybody to our third webinar on share incentives. My name is Raquel Scott. I'm a finance undergrad at Wits University, and today I am joined by Guy Addison, MD of Addison-Comline. Guy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, good morning, Raquel, and to the listeners. Yes, I work in a corporate finance consultancy, and we have a particular focus on company alignment structures. These include share incentives, succession plans, and equity-based transactions. It's good to be with everyone again. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Guy. Now, I note that this is the third webinar that you have done on share incentives, correct?
Yes, correct. The first was really an introduction to share incentives as a subject and was a general overview of executive remuneration. In our second webinar, we dealt specifically with the current structures that are available in South Africa and why these structures are being brought to the attention of shareholders by the media and asset managers, particularly some of the weaknesses and inherent problems with these structures.
Thank you, Guy. Just a reminder to our participants, if you would like to post a question or request a follow-up after this webinar, please do so in the comment section, and hopefully we will leave some time at the end to answer some of your questions. Guy, I have read a few articles that are very critical of how companies are paying executives. There seems to be a lot of, let's say, anger at the widening gap between executive remuneration and what ordinary employees get. So is this what your company is trying to resolve?
Well, Raquel, whilst I'm certainly aware of the issues and support calls for that gap to be addressed, I must state up front that I'm not against executives earning what they currently earn. But this should only happen if shareholder interests are aligned. What's happening now is that companies, and by implication shareholders, are doing very poorly, whilst executives are enjoying greater and greater guaranteed packages.
Perhaps you could start by briefly explaining why incentives are necessary at companies. I mean, surely executives get paid enough?
Yes, I would love to earn what some of the executives earn. That's top echelon of management, enjoy fantastic packages, and we certainly get to see them in their remuneration reports and in the disclosure. But we do have to remember that these executive teams take on an enormous amount of responsibility. The guys and girls that are looking after these companies are responsible for billions of rands of shareholder funds. Not to mention that there's also debt, and many of these organizations owe billions to lenders and the banks. They have a lot on their plate. The stress and pressure they experience is astronomical, as are the working hours. So for many, it is really their one chance to leave a lasting legacy on the organizations that they are privileged to lead. And hopefully, along the way, they also want to add value to the company and by implication, their own net worth.
Okay, if you put it that way, then maybe they do deserve what they get paid. But why are long-term incentives important?
Ultimately, it's in long-term incentives that shareholders' goals and objectives are aligned with the executives that they employ to steward and manage the companies for which they own shares in. That is a supposition, though, and there's a lot to be questioned about whether that relationship still holds true and that do long-term incentives actually align the interests of shareholders with management.
But why would you say it's supposed?
Well, just if you have to look in the press, in the news, read a business magazine, you'll see what's currently being criticized is that these long-term incentives, one, are not aligning shareholders. They're leading to some incredibly big risk-taking decisions and behavior by the management. And in actual fact, at the final analysis, they're just not working. They're not doing what they should. Most long-term incentives are made up of share schemes, meaning they actually proposedly get shareholders or allow executives to become shareholders. They're also commonly called restricted share schemes, and the most popular one, which is really prevalent in most organizations, are things called share appreciation rights or bonus shares. But in such schemes, the executives don't actually own the shares for many years. And what's worse, in current share incentive structures, the executive rarely actually receives shares, but rather takes the cash. This is largely because the executives need to settle an immediate tax liability of 45% on any gains made. So you can imagine most executives don't have the type of cash available to take delivery of the shares and pay the cash and pay the tax. I believe it's actually more appropriate to call these structures derivatives, as they derive their value from changes in the value of the share price. They're also designed, accounted for, and managed like derivatives and not shares. So really, Raquel, it's no wonder that most people don't really understand what these structures are and why they don't work as an incentive for alignment tool.
If our listeners would like to listen to the webinars where Guy discusses these issues in more detail, please check out the invitation for the links or email info@addison-comline.co.za for a copy of the webinar. Now, Guy, what are we going to be talking about today?
Raquel, today we'd like to talk about innovations in alignment structures, particularly for those that are charged with leading organizations, being executive directors and the senior levels of management.
It seems to me that there's not a lot being done to fix some of the inconsistencies in executive remuneration.
Yes, certainly if you read the press, the common press, you'd feel like really there's no changes afoot, but actually on deeper analysis, I'm aware that there are some moves afoot in developed markets. We take our lead largely from English-speaking countries such as the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States. But in these markets, we see that there are moves being taken to force companies to re-look at their share structures and ultimately broaden their governance and be more responsible stewards of shareholder investments. Boards are ultimately the custodian of corporate governance at companies, and they're starting to design actual shareholding structures where the executives hold the real shares. They're even mandating minimum shareholding requirements, often called MSRs, for executives, in the attempt to align the interests of shareholders with the executives who they ultimately employ to look after their interests. Voting by shareholders on remuneration structures has also become popular, but now some countries are requiring that this is to be a binding vote as opposed to merely an advisory vote. Hence, those companies' directors that continue to disregard shareholder concerns will ultimately lose their jobs. And finally, activist shareholders, specifically asset managers, pension funds, and community-based organizations, are starting to exert influence on companies to make positive changes regarding corporate governance concerns. Problem is, in South Africa, we generally take a lead from developed markets, and hence we expect many of these positive changes, but only delayed once they're effectively implemented in the developed economies. But I do believe that this is broadly positive to the way companies and by extension our investments in these companies are managed.
Okay, well, that's great to hear and encouraging and certainly exciting in your field of expertise. Can you share with us more about Addison-Comline's role in effective change in the space?
Okay, certainly. Let's first start with the recognition that current share incentive structures in South Africa are all the same. Whatever you call them, they're ultimately all restricted share structures, and this means that they vest based on a certain set of performance criteria, both corporate and personal. For example, if an executive decides to leave the company because they get a better offer somewhere else, then they will lose a significant portion of the incentives, as it can be revoked under certain conditions.
Does that mean that executives also feel the pain when the company's share price tanks? If you look at the remuneration of executives against the performance of our stock market, it appears that the two are completely unrelated.
Yes, you're right. There's a worrying disconnect between share performance and executive performance. My personal view is that the executives are negotiating greater and greater guaranteed pay because the current share incentive structures that they're being offered just don't work. This could also be the reason why no one is making any positive changes to the current schemes in place. It's working for executives and the broader industry. In fact, if you look back, there's actually been very little innovation in this space for long-term incentives for almost 2 decades. And so this place the area really needs to be revolutionized.
Okay, so the real issue is not the quantum of pay, but really the fact that executives are not making decisions like shareholders.
Yeah, that's spot on, Nicole. No one who's working at the top of companies wants the company they work for to do poorly. But the way these schemes are set up is forcing executives to gamble with their companies, by which I mean there are no consequences if the decisions executives make on behalf of the company result in a disastrous erosion of value. And the listed companies are littered with examples of that. The real problem is executives just don't feel the erosion of value in their pockets.
But these structures are all linked to the share price. Surely if the company tanks, the executive also loses out.
Yes, whilst they're linked to the share price, we know from recent experience that share price performance is not causally linked to the employee performance. Executives are either fortuitous or very unlucky, by which I mean that if the structure coincides with the growth of the share price, they can do very well. But if there are external shocks, just think like COVID, macro shocks in the US, or any number of unknown factors, then the scheme often loses out terribly, resulting in much unhappiness. You've seen many companies on the JSE bailing out their executives because the share structure is just not going to ever actually make them any money. This is a disincentive, and it's warping the incentives and corporate governance in the world in general.
That sounds pretty bad for the executives.
Yeah, that's contrary to popular belief. Actually, executives' behavior is being shaped by these ineffective structures. It places ordinary shareholders at risk too, because the value of the investments is sharply influenced by executive decisions. We think of poor capital allocation and management generally of the company. It's all influenced by how the executive is incentivized. And what we're seeing right now is that many corporates, and by implication, the executives that are running these companies, are just making very poor decisions.
So it's a lose scenario. I mean, the company's executives and shareholders all lose.
That's pretty right. Yeah, absolutely. Although there's varying degrees of loss, ultimately you could say that companies and executives and shareholders are not actually maximizing their ultimate gain by the structures that are in place.
Is there a solution now, Guy?
Well, we think there is a solution. We maintain that unrestricted shares are the best mechanism for aligning management with shareholders.
That sounds like a tax term, right?
Yes, well done. It is a tax term. I can see that you've been reading up on your share incentive tax law, Raquel. Absolutely correct. These are structures that are not covered under Section 8C of the SA Income Tax Act. Essentially, 8C mandates that any share structures that vest in the future are restricted, and hence any gains made during that period of vesting, whilst they're still restricted, is subject to income tax. And as you know, they've just increased the marginal effective tax rate for the top income bracket, which you can assume most executives fall into, to 45%. So what we are seeing right now in the market, a lot of executives are coming back and saying, gee, I really thought I was worth X because of my long-term incentive, but because of the 45% tax bracket that I now fall into, almost half of the actual gain that I thought I was going to make, I have to pay in tax. Not only that, but the accounting compliance and complexity related to valuing these instruments is extremely complex. It would take an entire webinar just to try and explain some of the ways that people are trying to value these things. I have commented on in the media that this really is beyond what most people can really understand, particularly ordinary shareholders. But it's absolutely a nightmare. And quite frankly, it's so complex that it actually distracts management from focusing on their role, which is ultimately to improve the companies they work at.
Okay, so just to confirm, unrestricted structures don't vest.
Actually, Raquel, they vest immediately. What I'm saying is that the executive is effectively subscribing for shares on day one and expected to act like a shareholder from day one. So they're not waiting on getting shares if they're lucky or something changes in the market or the share price has a run. They are subscribing for shares from day one. And it's really the simplicity and the effectiveness of being a shareholder that we are expecting executives to then suddenly behave like shareholders.
Okay, well, if that's that, then what makes them such an appropriate tool for share incentives today?
Well, they're actually shares, so they're not derivatives. You don't receive them for services rendered, so they're not in lieu of, let's say, 5 years worth of good service and behaving. These executives subscribe for them as any shareholder would, and it achieves alignment for shareholders and management from day one. So as management improve the performance of the company, so the shares grow in value.
So this is a real alignment structure that gets management to sit in the same camp as shareholders.
That's right, yeah. So we believe that it is the best mechanism for ensuring that there really is no divide and warped incentive for what management are doing in companies and what the shareholders are expecting of them. We call our structure the accelerated buy-in, or ABI for short, and it's similar to a management buyout structure, or MBO, in which a management are able to buy into the business that they manage. If you've heard of a carried interest structure, which is used in private equity, where shareholders gain in the business they purchase, if the performance improves in that business, this is this can be likened to that type of approach and methodology in which management are effectively saying, all right, we're taking a business from a valuation of 100 to a valuation of 150, and we expect to gain in the improvement of that performance from 100 to 150.
And what are some of the benefits, Guy?
As I've mentioned, the terms are preferential. So this allows management to invest a meaningful stake into the business that they are managing. It also allows for any debt that is taken on the subscription price to purchase the shares to be readily repaid. So essentially it allows for the executives to take debt out in order to purchase shares and use the performance of the company ultimately to repay any debt that's incurred. Existing shareholders are diluted only if there is growth. And that's oftentimes one of the key concerns of shareholders, issuing shares at low or no value to participants, particularly in other sectors of the economy, in that they're giving something away. However, there's only dilution here of existing shareholders if there is growth. I think that successfully aligns the interests of management with the shareholders themselves. The returns are directly dependent on the company performance. And this is a big distinction from existing derivative type structures, in that it's not based on the movement in the share price. It actually is a true share, and therefore is based on the performance of the company. It can also be cash flow neutral under certain circumstances, not all, but certain circumstances. And further, these incentives are easier to design, implement, and manage. So therefore, they reduce the cost and by implication, the headache that companies are currently facing when bringing in a long-term share incentive. And finally, the compliance, tax treatment, and the reporting are also much simpler, which we believe is really needed right now. Executives, and by implication, the companies, are spending a lot of time and effort in trying to comply with governance standards, which is not leading to the right results for those companies themselves.
Okay, so I see you're looking at the impact on the company, existing shareholders, and the participants of these structures.
Yes, that's correct. Absolutely. It's our version of what we call the triple bottom line: the company, existing shareholders, and the participants of these incentives, otherwise known as management. It's an important record to consider all three dimensions when designing the structure to ensure that one constituent is not losing out at the expense of the other. Presently, we find existing shareholders at companies are losing heavily in order to pay management, regardless of management's ability or the results achieved.
In other words, your goal is to achieve a win-win-win scenario now.
Yes, you could say that, a win-win-win. As external advisors and professionals, we are seeking to design an incentive that really achieves an optimal outcome for all parties involved. And in designing these structures, we engage in an extensive scenario and modeling exercise to ensure that under all situations, the shareholders, the participants, and the ultimate company itself understands exactly what's going to happen as a result of these structures being implemented.
I'm sure that you have whetted the appetite of our audience now. Before we review the questions that have come in, I just have a few more technical questions, if that's okay.
Yes, certainly.
Firstly, how long would your structure typically last?
Okay. Well, bearing in mind that the structure does not vest over a period of time. So remember, you get you subscribe for shares on day one. So the structure doesn't come to an end like current share structures do, or derivative type structures. We do perform, as I've mentioned, an extensive modeling and scenario plan with clients, and existing clients that are using the structure the term of ownership of the shares is typically between 7 and 10 years. And the debt that is taken out in order to subscribe for the shares is typically repaid within 3 to 5 years. Of course, that would depend on the specific circumstances of the company and the size and extent of the structure that is implemented. But we maintain that it's a highly efficient structure. And what's important is it really is a long-term incentive as opposed to current share structures that are implemented, which are called long-term incentives, but they actually vest over 1 to 3 years. And as we know, that cannot be considered long-term. So, this is really a true long-term incentive structure. We believe it's what the market and the industry is looking for.
Thank you. And is the structure suitable for listed and private companies?
Yes, we've currently implemented the structure within private companies in the private sector, particularly in companies that are looking for succession type scenarios where management are taking a meaningful stake in the business and stepping up into a shareholder role. But we have taken advice that the structure is appropriate for listed companies. And so we'd like to see it available to both listed and private companies in both scenarios.
Awesome. And what other factors should companies consider before implementing this?
The structure is particularly effective in profitable companies with a defined dividend flow, as dividends are ultimately generated by the company and the company continues to perform. It's those dividends that are used to finance any loan or debt that's taken out. It also, as I've mentioned, has excellent succession benefits, whereby management can, over a period of time, take a greater equity stake in the business as they prove their worth. So we're happy to interact with the participants on this call, or if anyone wants to share our details, and we can share further details on both the alignment benefits as well as the succession planning benefits that the accelerated buy-in offers.
Awesome. Okay, and then just one more from me. What about the tax?
That's a very good question. Thank you. Yes, the tax is oftentimes what trips up existing share structures, and it's always amazing to me how few executives and participants in these schemes currently actually understand what structures have been implemented. It really takes a lot to be able to understand these structures. It's also important to understand that SARS is keenly focused on share incentives, even more so today than before. And they will continue to review executive share incentive structures, not only because they're on a hunt for additional revenue for the fiscus, but because there's also a lot of non-compliance risk here. We find that a lot of executives in practice believe that their structures are capital in nature, whereas it's evident under Section 8C that they are restricted and hence they are subject to income tax. Our view is that the accelerated buy-in structure is similar to any capital raise and hence will be treated as capital in nature. Hence, what that means ultimately is that a marginal effective tax rate on final sale of those items would be currently at the marginal, at the highest rate, 18.5, whereas the highest rate of income tax is currently 45%, which applies to vesting structures. We have used well-known tax advisors to review the structure and received a clear go-ahead that this does not infringe on any restrictions as laid out and defined in the tax laws. And we've ultimately taken a very conservative approach to designing the structure. As professionals, we're very aware of the pressure that existing remuneration consultants are under, and hence we don't want to become part of the problem and rather be seen as part of the solution.
That is a very big claim to make, Guy. Are you able to substantiate that?
Yes, Raquel, we're very happy to review a client or potential client's existing long-term incentive structure and your scheme and validate our claims. And we'd be happy to interact with anyone on the call about their current structure if they would like to have a second opinion or just make sure that what they have in place is currently how they understand it.
Awesome, thank you. Let's review some of the questions coming through from our listeners. So firstly, Guy, what stops an executive from gaming the situation by manipulating the share price in your structure?
Wow, okay, that's a tough question, but yes, ultimately any structure, regardless of who implements it or how it's implemented, requires a higher level of integrity on the part of management, particularly the board, who are responsible for governance within that company, and the implementation and required disclosure of that structure. So yes, it is possible to game the situation, and no structure is immune from manipulation. But we maintain that the accelerated buy-in really is the best mechanism for aligning interests of the company's shareholders and management within a responsible corporate entity that has the appropriate control environment in place.
Surely, if remuneration consultants have introduced existing structures, they would be the first ones to understand why they don't work and change them immediately.
Yes, absolutely true. And it's taken a while for me to realize that many of these structures have taken years to implement, to design, that has resulted in enormous costs and amounts of effort to see these structures implemented. And many of them are vesting over numbers of years, and hence they're very difficult to draw a line in the sand and cancel. Boards are reluctant because they're familiar. And remember, many of the boards are made up with people that have spent years designing remuneration and implementing it. So they're very familiar with the structures that are currently in place, and they're very reluctant as a result to look at anything new. They've spent a lot of time and effort to implement them, and it's often just easier to reset the vesting details. You've seen it in many listed companies where they just change the way these things pay out, or they simply pay an executive a bonus or an ex gratia payment rather than change the entire structure. You look in the remuneration disclosure of many listed companies, you'll see that the long-term incentives are not paying anything out, but they're not changing them. They're leaving them, and in fact, changing the terms under which the executives earn a guaranteed pay. Now, that's great if you're an executive, and nice that you can change your remuneration, but I don't think it's leading to the right decisions for the end user, being the shareholder that ultimately has to pay that amount. It's ultimately shareholders that are footing the bill with no alignment of the decisions being taken by management.
Thank you. Okay, this one comes from a remuneration consultant. Guy, are you willing to share your structure with the industry to see it implemented faster?
Yes, absolutely. I think what's more important is to see our corporate sector, particularly within the listed environment, broadly aligned with the shareholders that have lost extensive value of late. So yes, this is meant as a positive change. We would be happy to interact with corporate boards and the broader remuneration consulting industry on this to see broadly adopted and better alignment structures in place.
Okay, then a question here from Nicole. So if there's no growth, the exec will be held liable for the debt raised to buy the shares.
Yes, that's correct. And absolutely one of the key things that we would say, that if you're an executive and you're prepared to earn multi-million rand salaries, many of them in the hundreds of millions of rands, that you would also be prepared to take equal risk that shareholders are taking in order to subscribe for shares in the company that you're managing. And we recognize that this structure is not a one-size-fits-all mentality. It is for appropriate circumstances. And thus, what is currently being touted out there is really just a one-size-fits-all mentality. So a good point, and certainly a weakness of the structure, is that it's expecting executives to take a role as a shareholder. And if executives are not prepared to do that, then maybe the structure isn't appropriate for them. But a very good question. Thanks, Rico.
Cool. Thank you, Guy. We have another question from Mr. Scratton. He says, hi, Guy. What is the exit price of the structure? Valuation dependent on future growth in profit, so different to existing?
No, it can't be done like that. The reason being is that our view on a conservative basis from a tax perspective is if you define any valuation of the instrument up front, you effectively introduce an artificial restriction, and thus you end up straight back in 8C. So it's a common question asked by quite sophisticated remuneration consultants, is that you can't gain the exit price. You really have to allow the executive to trade in these instruments as they see fit based on an open market, arm's length type of mentality. What that means is that the structure is really appropriate for, let's call them sophisticated executives. Hopefully they're the people that are being employed to steward and manage the company on behalf of shareholders, and hence why we don't suggest the accelerated buy-in for a broad-based shareholding or incentive structure for an entire company, but really only the executive team, that one have the sophistication to understand what owning shares and acting as responsible shareholders is, and two, are able to exit the shares in a responsible manner.
Stefano here says, while he asks, what happens if after several years the exec goes rogue and the share price falls? The company then is owed money by a non-performer, which is not ideal.
Yeah, there's always a chance of that. And I would say there's always a chance of an executive going rogue and the current executive share structures. There's nothing to say, executives won't lose the plot and go completely crazy. But ultimately, what we're trying to accomplish here is where the board is satisfied that executive is going to act in the best interest of shareholders, they should be allowed to take the same risks as the shareholders are taking. So there are circumstances where, based on personal actions or on the actions of the board itself, an executive may not necessarily enjoy the same benefits that they currently enjoy. But in almost all circumstances that the share appreciation, or rather that an accelerated buy-in structure is implemented, there is alignment with shareholders. And what can be stated right now is there is no alignment between shareholders and the executives with the current long-term incentives. You're effectively issuing them with a derivative, and those shareholders are acting in accordance with that derivative to try and grow the share price as opposed to improve the performance of the company that they're ultimately being asked to manage.
Cool. And then, this has really been an issue for many years now, and is more so as real proven top talent is so scarce. But who wants to run a company in this environment? The lack of transparency and real accountability is the biggest issue, as many of the talent are not really that good. This comes from Zipo. And he's asking why most of the boards aren't transparent and not accountable now.
Yeah, Zipo is a good question. I think it goes to the core of some of the concerns that let's call it ordinary shareholders like Zipo and myself are asking of the companies that we invest our savings and pensions in. Is, we are trusting both the boards and executives to steward and look after our investments carefully. As a country, a large proportion of our savings and investments in South Africa are invested in listed companies. And the level of response and disclosure from corporate boards has left a lot to be desired in terms of aligning the incentives of executives and the common shareholders, of which I'm one, that are looking at these companies and saying, it doesn't appear like these executives are doing what's right for me as a shareholder. They seem to be taking a lot of decisions which are looking after themselves and not the general body of shareholders. So our structure is certainly not something that we believe will solve all those problems, but we do believe that it will ultimately be part of the solution. And hopefully it will be implemented in companies that really believe in responsible stewardship of the shareholder funds that they are entrusted with. So Zipo, I'm sorry I can't solve that entire problem, but we believe that we, with the accelerated buy-in, are part of the solution.
Awesome, thank you. Guys, anything else you would like to add?
Raquel, I'd just like to say thank you very much for your first attendance on our webinar as the host, and I think you did incredibly well. I appreciate your questions and your insights and assistance in preparing for the webinar. And thank you for the participants who've joined us, particularly those that have come back again to listen to me. And I really open myself up for any interaction with the participants. If they'd like to contact me via email, our details will be left at the bottom of the webinar, and look forward to taking this further with those that are interested. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Guy, for your time and having me today and hosting this awesome webinar on executive remuneration. And thank you to our listeners. Like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact him. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.